Fellow Redditors, what was a moment where you thought a person you knew might be an actual psychopath? One of my neighbors when I was little had some hamsters. One day I was at her house and she started squeezing them and making them poop because she thought it was funny. She just kept squeezing them harder and harder. I told her to stop or she might hurt them and she started laughing. The next day I asked her grandma what happened to her hamsters and she told me they all died. Another time we were making PB&J sandwiches in her room, I'd quite lol, and she cornered me with a knife while laughing. I looked her up a few years ago and found her mugshot. Played soccer with a guy in high school that had a real short temper and enjoyed playing the sport as rough as possible, even at practice. Coaches had to tell him to calm down all the time. Everyone hated him and stayed away from him. Several years later he murdered a classmate of mine over some weed. He hid the body under a pile of leaves in his backyard. When I heard the news, I wasn't surprised in the least. My older sister used to absolutely torture me when I was a kid. When I was 5 to 6, she was 7 to 8, I was afraid of bugs. She would spend hours trapping bugs and putting them in my Matchbox cars. Then she'd say, "Hey, science forbid, wanna play cars?" I would get super excited because she never wanted to play with me. I'd run to my cars and there would be bugs crawly all over. Frown. Then when I was 7, I was obsessed with Barbies. One day she grabbed my favorite Barbie and Ken and threw them under the bed. I stuck my tongue out at her and climbed under the bed to get them. As I army crawled in the cramped space, my arms started to hurt. I was getting pricked all over every time I moved. And I was bleeding. It took me until I was halfway way under the bed to figure out what my psychopath sister had done. She had spent all morning weaving push pins into the carpet so the points would stick up and stab me. She then tricked me into climbing under the bed. So, there I am, halfway in with my precious Barbie and Ken at the back wall. I had to decide to cut my losses and abandon Barbie and Ken, or climb the rest of the way through the Saw-esque minefield and back out. I bit the bullet. Amy, if you read this, F you. A few years ago, I had to put my cat, Rex, down. He was 21 years. In passing, not too long ago, I mentioned this to a friend I've known for over 35 years. Out of nowhere he made the statement, "I always liked killing cats." I did a double take to see if he was kidding. He wasn't. Haven't spoken to him since. My dad said for years that someone I knew at primary school, 7 to 11, was a psychopath because he often got in fights with random people and showed no empathy after breaking their bones, and he would often lie about staff to get them in trouble. I thought he was scary and a bit violent, but an alright guy overall. I found out a couple of years ago he's been sentenced to life for murder. She kicked my leg while we were ice skating to make me fall. I really hurt my back, I couldn't get up, could barely talk and had trouble breathing. I asked her please to call someone but she just stood there and laughed at me for a few minutes until I was able to crawl to my phone and call someone. She also said to my adopted brother that he is worth nothing because even his real parents left him in the trash. It was the only time I ever punched someone in the face. When my ex-boss at the youth service actually barricaded the door of her office to stop me leaving. She had me cornered in my wheelchair, the office was too small for me to turn round. Meanwhile my colleagues were outside the office literally trying to break the door down to rescue me. He kicked my dog, and when I told him off, he said something along the lines of, "Well, it's not like it's feeling matter." Another friend said, "How would you feel if we kicked you?" And he said that we couldn't do anything that would hurt him. I think he joined the military, but I honestly have lost all contact. When I was 8 I let my older cousin who was probably 11 or 12 at the time hold my hamster. She was begin really rough with it so I told her to put it back into its cage. She got really mad after this and just stared at me for about 2 minutes before she turned around and threw my hamster into the wall. My poor hamster died instantly and I was crying because my hamster had just gotten murdered. I knew after she threw it something was extremely wrong with her and my mom made my aunt come and pick her up and she wasn't allowed to be near any animals after this. It's been almost 4 years since I've talked to her but apparently she gets into fights almost weekly, and beat somebody so bad they had to go to ER. She's in therapy and has spent time in juvenile detention. All of my other cousins are afraid of her and many of us think she's going to eventually kill somebody. I honestly think the best place for her would be a mental health hospital. When I had a parent-teacher conference with a student of mine's mom and dad. This was maybe 15 years ago, but it stuck with me. The daughter had some minor issues with math, 3rd grade, and the father insisted that he was a physics professor at an Ivy League university nearby. When I told him his daughter was struggling with the US standard algorithm, he got upset and told me he didn't understand what the word algorithm means. And he's a physics professor? Okay. When I began to explain, his face got completely flat and devoid of any expression. His wife immediately noticed the look on his face. He was staring right at me, not blinking or saying anything, and her face blanched, and she started pulling on his arm and trying to get his attention, off me, I assume. When I described it later, I called it a serial killer face. He eventually let her pull him out of the room and end the conference. I immediately told my principal and said I refused to do another conference alone with these people. I definitely felt as though if I were alone with this man, he would have come after me physically. His wife's response was very telling. I only dealt with her from then on. Edit. Since so many people have commented on this, I didn't actually say US standard algorithm to the parent. I shouldn't have put it here either. It seems the term is confusing lol. I said addition and subtraction algorithm. When explaining, I was very careful to say it in a way that isn't condescending. I would never expect parents to just know math terms, but I am a talker, so sometimes when I'm explaining I just forget that they might not know it and get carried away with explaining. I might have even apologized for using the term and not just saying carrying and borrowing, which I usually do, but I can't remember now. When I was about 7 or 8 there was a kid who was about 6. We found a baby bird that fell out of its nest. In the time it took for me to go home and tell an adult, he put it in the road and ran over it on his bike and laughed. Last I heard, Hess in jail for beating his girlfriend. F you Kevin. My period was late and I had let the dude know it was first time my period was ever late while on birth control pills, but I had recently switched to a different one. He immediately started blaming me for not taking my birth control right and that if I was pregnant he would kill me. I even told him I doubted I was pregnant and not to worry and that the doctor told me that it might happen. I went to high school with a guy. We weren't close but had a lot of mutual friends, so we were around each other a lot. Once he beat a guy with a tire iron when the guy tried to scam him when he was selling some weed or something. Later on, he went to Iraq and was in some crap. He came home on leave at some point and I was at a bar playing pool with him and he nonchalantly talked about killing people over there. Said he enjoyed it. He was always very calm and chill when I was around him, but I tried to avoid him after that. There was something broken in there. The weirdest part is that he would have these moments or anecdotes of extreme violence, but he always related them calmly. Never felt any sort of regret for any of it. Obviously you can't diagnose someone off of that sort of thing, but I've read that sociopaths make good soldiers and he was fairly successful in the army, I believe. He found God 3 times in the course of a year. Each time after he had been seen doing significant property damage or emotionally abusing a girl he was with. Like the God thing was a quick trick to get people off his butt. I met an individual who later pled guilty to his involvement in about 14 murders. During an interview about his childhood and personal life, it became very apparent that he had no interest in other people and that they were basically NPCs to him, even his girlfriend and child. He was in a gang and his behavior was basically shadowing the other guys with status. He had a girlfriend because that's what the other guys did. He had a fancy car. He wore the right clothes. The other guys figured out early on that he was not bothered by murder or gunfights, so he was their hitter. During the interview, he was perfectly polite, but utterly flat in his affect and didn't attempt to dissemble or minimize a lot of terrible things that happened to him or the things he'd done. It made for an interesting interview.